Aloha and welcome. Welcome to ThinkTech, and this is Global Connections, part of the ThinkTech series. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and it gives me great pleasure today to welcome a guest who's going to join us to understand some important events happening very soon in India. India will be holding some national elections, and as we'll see, important for us to sort of step back and reflect on what this means for the country, for the region, and for global affairs. As part of the ThinkTech series, our show, Global Connections, is important because it helps bring the world to you here, and we bring Hawaii as well to the world. We come to you live here from the heart of downtown Honolulu at Pioneer Plaza. And joining me today is our guest, Patrick Bratton. And Patrick, I want to thank you for joining us. Patrick, you're a professor of political science here at Hawaii Pacific University, and also have had a lot of experience, a visiting scholar, and quite a number of research trips to India. Mm-hmm. So I want to just first thank you for joining us, and maybe ask if you can tell us a little bit about some of your own India background. You've had many trips there now, and we'll continue going later this summer. Give us a quick snapshot, and welcome back to the show.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, Carlos. I've been working particularly on sort of Indian foreign and security policy for the past 7 to 10 years, and I make annual trips to India. I've been a visiting international fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, which is India's sort of largest, most prestigious foreign affairs think tank. I will be, as you mentioned before, I will be heading there in mid-May to about mid-June, so it'd be post-election to do some research and doing some research on defense reforms and conducting some interviews and so on. So to me, it's always such a vibrant and dynamic, if somewhat chaotic country, and the elections are sort of a nice microcosm for them.
Absolutely. And of course, India, very important because we know it as the world's largest democracy, and indeed the upcoming elections, they begin March 16. I'm sorry, no, they begin April 7 in a couple of days, but they go on for quite a while. It's not easy to put on elections in such a large country, and one of the things I want us to maybe begin with is understanding, well, a little bit more about the context. Here is this large country, diverse, and how exactly do elections happen in a country? It's not as if here in the U.S. we have an election on a given day and the next morning the results are out. Tell us a little bit more about that.
It's normally about a month-long process. So as you've hinted, to start off in just about a week's time, and it'll go into about, I think, May 10th or May 12th, like that. It's normally about a 4-week process, and it's done regionally. So different states will go, and it's staggered. It's a huge enterprise. I mean, given that India is the second largest populated country in the entire world, but it's really impressive if you think about the scale of this.
Of course.
I think it's something like 700 million registered voters in India. There's something like 800,000 polling stations. By law, they have to have a polling station within about 2 kilometers of every registered voter. So the amount of size that's going on. And then also if you will, some of the difficulties, again, because we're dealing with a developing country, high rates of poverty, very unequal income distribution, also very unequal educational literacy. So dealing with the fact that, some 40% of, say, the Indian female population is illiterate, they've got to have a lot of visual clues for the parties to aid people to vote. And
so a lot of pictures you would find that represent, or maybe symbols that represent parties and things like that.
Yes, exactly. So the Congress Party has the hand, the BJP has the lotus and saffron colors and so on. And it's quite a spectacle. The Indians have a term for spectacles called tamasha, the great tamasha. And so the Indian elections, you have parties and drinking parties and those widely painted Indian trucks, with all sorts of graffiti on them and people blaring loudspeakers. Amazing. And it's quite a show. It's quite a show.
Well, I mean, just as you note the scale and scope of it, I mean, putting on an election, this is not an easy task under any circumstance, and then facing the challenge of a country with lots of just challenges of the logistics, and yet they've been doing this a while now. It's a country that's a pretty firmly established democracy, and yet one of these countries of paradoxes. It's an old civilization and country of many rich traditions, fairly new democracy. The political system comes really in the second half of the 20th century. As you look at, maybe you give us another snapshot of, I guess, what have been some of the trends and maybe patterns that we've seen in recent decades. Here's a country that as well has had its own share of sort of like a dynasty of a family, and this upcoming election now seems to be in many ways a test of that, either likely, decline of that firm control. Give us a snapshot of some of the trends in elections.
It's interesting. The Indian electoral sort of political landscape has radically changed in the past 20 to 30 years. So at independence, the heir of Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, who led the Congress Party, was prime minister at independence and led the country until his death in '64. Then shortly afterwards, his daughter, Indira Gandhi, which has no relation to Gandhi, it's just a different, same name but different family. His daughter became prime minister in the 70s and into the 1980s. Quite controversially, she was the closest in some periods where the emergency, the closest that India came from moving away from a democracy.
And herself died, in a hail of bullets from some bodyguards.
Her Sikh bodyguards in retaliation for their crackdown on the Golden Temple. The thing that's interesting is that for a long time, because of the domination of this family and then also of the Congress Party, India was sort of one of those one-party states, much like Mexico with the PRI or with Japan with the LDP, one party dominating all the elections. This electoral pattern was essentially broken by the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 90s. At the same time, we see these other changes in India, where India emerges from its sort of non-alignment, sort of socialist internal development to opening up to the world economy and so on and so forth. And so what we've seen since really the early 1990s is that you've seen a splintering of parties or proliferation of many smaller parties and an inability of any single party to dominate. So while we talk about two major parties in India, the Congress Party, which is a sort of center-left party, the heir of sort of the Indian National Congress for Independence, and then the BJP, sort of a center-right Hindu revivalist party. While those are the two major parties, no party has won an election with an outright majority in the party. They have to assemble coalitions. And so, go ahead.
And just in this upcoming election, just to be clear, these are elections for the lower house of Parliament, which is, of course, the big entity, the big legislature. But in reading some of the background, no party is expected to win an outright majority. So it'll be this, need to kind of negotiate and bargain. Much of what you were describing too speaks to, while you've got these well-entrenched party systems, so much of it seems to be driven by personalistic, a leader who just somehow, embraces this bigger, grander thing, and how much is that the case? I mean, you've had this legacy of very powerful, or at least strong figureheads, even a dynasty of sorts. Is there anybody today that stands in that, or is it not quite the same?
It's interesting. Dynastic politics remain a major factor in India. And so you have studies done that show that oftentimes while we talk about the sort of Gandhi dynasty and then certain dynasties within the BJP, you see a proliferation of small dynasties where seats are handed down in families or larger extended families in various states. So the Congress, or not the Congress, the sort of dynastic link is there all over the parliament elections. So as you were saying, this is the elections for the Lok Sabha, which is the lower house of the parliament, which is one that's directly elected by the people. The upper house, similar to upper houses in many other countries, is indirectly elected by state governments and so on and so forth. So you've got the heir of the sort of dynasty, the young heir, which is sort of Rahul Gandhi, and he's the son of Rajiv Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi. Rajiv Gandhi had been the prime minister in the 1980s. Rajiv had never been expected to become prime minister. He was an airline pilot.
That's right.
Kind of a jet set.
The reluctant jet setter who, with his mother's death, he sort of became the heir apparent, right?
Yes, and he was sort of thrust upon it, and he had an Italian wife. And so Sonia Gandhi, who's the behind-the-scenes matriarch of the Congress Party, again, that's one of the difficulties Congress has had, is that people don't believe her to be a true Indian because she's from Italy and so on. So she's tried to push her son into being the sort of leader of the party, but he's quite young, quite inexperienced. He's had very limited, I think he's only given one major extended interview on TV, and his rallies have not, and his public speaking engagements in the past couple of years have not really sort of wowed the voters.
So he, despite the name that he may have on him, doesn't quite appear to be that. And of course, why are we interested in India? I mean, aside from the fact that it is such a large and vast country, as you mentioned earlier too, today, now in the early 21st century, it is a country that is clearly more of a global and regional power. I mean, if you look back in the 60s and 70s, it was looking inward. It was a closed, protectionist economy, and really looking inwardly. Today, given sort of the globalization of the world, India is important, and it's a rising, if we want to say power, clearly on different levels. And I wonder, one of the things that we'll continue to speak to, of course, is understanding what relevance this has, or if there are going to be any outcomes, or simply on another level, looking at the process of democracy, because we look at a lot of other countries that are, finding often, a democracy is not delivering it, what it's supposed to. I wonder if maybe you could speak a little more just the question of democracy. We speak of it, it is the world's largest democracy. It has all these inherent paradoxes of, vast poverty, inequality on the one hand, and yet when we say it's a democracy, what do we mean by that? I mean, there's a certain level of engagement by the people. They participate, they elect leaders. There are parties that represent their interests. I mean, how would you describe really what we call the nature of Indian democracy, if we can even say that?
It's a difficult
raucous,
question.
A little bit rowdy.
I'd like maybe start off with a sort of a puzzle that I often pose with my students. If you talk about the failure, difficulties of democracy in the developing world, particularly in post-colonial societies, if you go through the laundry list of reasons, lack of a shared identity, the colonial legacy, borders that might not make sense that were drawn up by colonial power, sectarian differences, linguistic, all sorts of the poverty, illiteracy, all these things. All of these things that are normally given as reasons why democracies don't work or have failed in parts of the developing world, India has sort of in spades. Yet democracy has sort of functioned there since the early 1950s, if not before. So on the one sense, we have this strong democracy. And I think what most people, if you're kind of looking at India as a sort of sympathetic skeptic, I guess you could say, the sort of split the difference sort of between two schools of thought. In one school of thought, you've got the optimists that say world's largest democracy, oldest democracy in Asia, so on and so forth. The skeptics will say, well, there's corruption, there's all sorts of human rights abuses, all sorts of stuff. India's just a democracy in name or something like that.
Or illiberal.
Illiberal, yeah. So if you split the difference, if you want to come up with an independent or sort of intermediate sort of solution, what often people will say is that the electoral process on the democracy is quite strong. The difficulty is sort of in this liberalism, as you've kind of mentioned, that the rule of law, the functioning of the court system, freedom of the press, and also dealing with the issues of corruption, which is quite a major one. And these sort of have been more the millstones that are sort of holding down Indian democracy. But the elections, tend to be very free, very open, and
in many, after so many years now, decades, and sort of generations, you have now inculcated. I mean, there's a sense of this is what we do. This is our process of as it may have its own flaws and so on. But the other aspect I often think of India, and I've only had one visit. I've had a chance to travel for a brief visit, so only seen a glimpse of it. But I have this sense of it partly from the colonial legacy, very bureaucratic, very much, and it obviously draws from its experience as a colonial, piece of the former British Empire. I mean, how would you describe the characteristics that are the legacy of British rule? I mean, in 5 seconds.
In 5 seconds.
No. I mean, but generally speaking, in terms of what it left behind, because compared to some other, colonial areas of the world, India clearly inherited a civil service and a bureaucracy, and perhaps has taken it to other levels since then.
Right. I always kind of explain it that there's a very long, strong legacy the British left, and it's a mixed legacy. On the one hand, the benefit is unlike some other independent countries. You could perhaps contrast India with, say, with the Belgian Congo, where the Belgians pack up and leave, and there's no infrastructure, there's nothing. Because the British were administering India within the sort of imperial dominion, India had an army, had a police force, had a civil service, had a court system, had a railway ministry, all sorts of development to have it as a state. And so the Indians were able, at independence, to sort of move in. And moreover, at least starting in the 20th century, there's a large amount of sort of slow Indianization of these services under the British, where more and more Indians were brought into the civil service, the legal system, the officer corps, the military, and so on. So they were able to sort of learn institutionally about how to do things. The sort of downside of this has been is that a lot of these state institutions have kept their colonial character. And this is a distinction that's often lost on us in the West, is that when we think of Britain, particularly here in the United States, we think of sort of the mother country. They gave us all Locke and all these wonderful things. But this is not necessarily a British institutions made to run Britain home. This is British institutions to run a colony. And so you do have this sort of non-democratic, non-responsive bureaucracy, a police force that has remained a mostly colonially trained and colonial mindset police force. And many studies have shown that a lot of the bureaucracy, the values that marked sort of the Indian civil service have leached over, in a sense, have been well preserved in the Indian administrative service today.
Well, it's a fascinating puzzle because, again, they've taken it and kind of morphed it, but as you noted, that the legacy is there, and perhaps in some ways it hasn't gotten rid of what was originally designed for a colonial power. But we know one thing about bureaucracies: they have a way of enduring, and they don't disappear. They seem to often grow and expand. So very bureaucratic. And yet bureaucracies exist because we have complicated societies that require some measure of rules and regulations. Well, fascinating stuff. As I want to continue our conversation, obviously we want to speak again more to the specifics of the elections that are upcoming, candidates, parties, and what's on the agenda. We're going to come back in just a moment after a short break. We're talking here with Patrick Bratton, a specialist that looks at India from many angles and has had a lot of experience there, helping us unravel what's upcoming now in the next few days. Over the next month, India will be facing national elections to determine their parliament, the lower house, and we'll see. It has some implications we should be aware of. A country that is clearly an important power in South Asia. So stay tuned. We'll be back with more on the story in just a moment.
Castle and Cook, Hawaii. Investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state. Collateral Analytics. Empowering the real estate industry to make better informed property investment decisions. The Foreign Trade Zone, bringing the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone programs to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. Galen Ho, a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company. Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island. The Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, incorporating diverse perspectives to design a flexible and forward-looking energy strategy. Hawaii Energy, the state's energy and efficiency program created to help Hawaii's residents and businesses adopt a clean energy lifestyle. Hawaii Gas, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future. Hawaii Pacific Health, bringing technology and teamwork together to transform healthcare in Hawaii. The High Tech Development Corporation, attached to DBED, is the state's leading technology agency. The Scheidler Family Foundation, supporting educational, cultural, and charitable organizations, including ThinkTech.
And we're back and we're live and we're ThinkTech. This is Global Connections. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and joined today by Patrick Bratton, a political scientist who's got expertise on India and has had now many years traveling there as a visiting scholar. Will be returning very shortly. And at the moment, we're looking at what is now beginning a process of a very large national election. And of course, here's a country that, like everything, we tend to simplify things. India, as if it's one singular thing with a single voice. Of course, India, very large, very complex and diverse. And I wonder if we might, just take a moment to kind of unravel some of that, because we need to understand both that it is even the system of government. It's a federal system, which lends itself when you have such a large and diverse population. But give us a quick snapshot in your mind of the country, and maybe if there are ways that you can kind of either divide it up or explain it. Even things as complex as the social classes. We know the caste system long existed, and while it's being redefined, or what can you tell us a little bit about India, just to provide some more context?
I think the thing that's always surprising or always important to keep in mind is that unlike a lot of other countries that we're used to having a sort of seeing it as a homogeneous. So particularly, I would say often in Hawaii, when we're looking at Asia, particularly in the Asia Pacific, we're often drawn to countries that are relatively homogeneous or very homogeneous, like Japan, South Korea, and so on. When you get to a country like India, it's so diverse, linguistically, religion, all different geographic areas, that it's very hard to sort of wrap your mind around it, or just to understand how much variation there can be state by state, region by region. There's a couple ways you can look at this. I mean, the traditional way is to sort of a North India, South India. So sort of North India is the area where you've got most of the languages are based off of Sanskrit. And Hindi is the dominant language, but there's Gujarati, there's Punjabi, all sorts of Marathi, all sorts of other languages. And the South was sort of removed from this and has its own Dravidian languages that you see in the South. And this is partially explained because the North was sort of open to these northern invasions that come across, that came down from Central Asia, Afghanistan, and from the west, from West Asia. And so Islam and other things move into the sort of northern India, and then South India is relatively sort of shielded from these various horse empires that move through. And you can see that quite starkly in contrast. So, for example, the architectural frame of reference in the North India is the fort. So you go to Red Fort, these big forts built by the Mughals and things like that. In the south, it's temples, and it's these older temples, and that's just kind of a visual way. But also, you can see it too as well. I mean, Northern India, particularly large, very populated regions like UP or Bihar, you have huge population densities, high levels of poverty. I mean, one of the examples I often give, you look at the state of UP, the population of UP, one Indian state, is larger than the population of Brazil. I mean, it's a huge, huge area.
Uttar Pradesh,
yeah. And Bihar as well, a very large population. Down in the south, generally speaking, the image that we have of the south is sort of the India that quote unquote works, if you will. That's sort of pejorative, if you will. That a lot of the business sort of media pay attention to. This is sort of Bangalore, the tech sectors, Kerala, the Kerala model for success, Tamil Nadu as well, quite successful. You tend to see less income disparity. You tend to see higher rates of literacy, more sort of empowerment of women, and so on and so forth. And that's sort of the popular image, India of the North, where you've got the poverty and you've got, market caste differences and things. I mean, both of those there's sort of stereotypes or generalizations, but there's always a kernel there. But then you also have places like the northeast of India, which has more in common with Southeast Asia, places like Burma, and other even parts of China, Tibet, that's often very far removed. Most people in India don't tend to think about the northeast. And then there's even more extremes like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, sort of India's Hawaii, if you will, an island chain territory that exists in the Indian Ocean. So it's really quite a diverse, from the Himalayas to the jungles, so to speak, quite a diverse place.
And yet somehow weave together, at least, in terms of administratively, a political system that both ensures a degree of autonomy through the regions, the federal system that divides power that way, and yet this national entity, the parliament that's coming under elections now, offers this coming together of a union, and it's a country that we can speak of, again, as you've said already, many paradoxes on the one hand, in terms of the differences and just the vast linguistic and religious, for that matter. One of the things, and I had an opportunity a couple of years ago to visit in the southwest, the state of Kerala, often noted for this development model. And one thing that struck me, and again I realized it was not perhaps the typical part of India, didn't see stark poverty and sort of some of the images that you might be more likely to see in the north and other areas. It is a region, Kerala, that's at least for some years now been dominated by a communist party, has a very clearly a sort of socialist model. What I found and came away with was this sense of there's just this passion for debate in politics and kind of people just want to and coming there as a foreigner, as an American, and you have to find yourself explaining everything, defending everything. There's this real, in terms of politics, just a real eager, everyone wants to make their point and show that they've, at least, among the people I was talking with, they're not, quiet and passive, I guess. That was my impression. The other thing that's surprised me quite a bit, and again, you can see this in many parts of the world, but the legacy of different, centuries ago, different, particularly European groups that had come there. This is a region that had a lot of settlers from Portugal, from this was the Malabar coast. I was struck by Christian churches everywhere, Catholic churches, and a lot of this just real mixed culture, and it was fascinating to me because, like a lot of things, it had its own sort of Indian flavor to it. So you'd be going and seeing this church, but it didn't look like the churches of Europe. It was clearly Indianized. Your own understanding of Kerala, this is again a small little subsection, but what else is it kind of perceived at? Because I had a sense that other Indians kind of always think of them in some certain way as rather distinct and unique and different.
Very, very different. One part of it too is that Kerala being on the south, because you can make a strong case if you're sort of to channel your inner Robert Kaplan and geography and all this, make a strong case that South India, particularly Kerala, is more linked to the sort of Indian Ocean and these and really to West Asia and these patterns that moved. We talk about how the Indian Ocean was a sort of its own region, just like the Mediterranean was in ancient times. And it's interesting with the Christian community in Kerala. Some of that are Catholics who came, with the Portuguese, but a large part of the Christian tradition there predates Western contact. It was Christians that came over from Ethiopia, from the Middle East.
Even a Jewish community very early on.
And so it's a bit different than the sort of North India that has this sort of more of a stronger link sort of with Central Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, sort of going where the movements of these horse people coming down from the south. Kerala is sort of this maritime sort of trading sort of tradition, very much tied to sort of this the Indian Ocean region.
Good food, I must say, a great mixture, and given the more tropical environment, lots of good use of coconut and other very spicy chilies. Certainly enjoyable there. But let's turn again maybe briefly to the question of these elections that are coming up. Of course, it's going to have candidates and parties at play and a range of issues, as all political sort of contests will have. I mean, briefly give us a quick snapshot of some of the either key candidates. You've mentioned Rahul Gandhi, the young son who presumably the heir apparent, but may not have the likelihood of winning on a massive scale. But who are there other parties or people that we can maybe look to keep our eyes open to see what's going to unfold?
Right, so we have this heir apparent to the Congress Party. Rahul seems to be, by most accounts, a sort of nice, earnest young man who's been sort of thrown into the position. I just as a kind of a funny anecdote, when I was talking of a class this semester on Indian foreign policy, and I showed my students some videos of the various candidates, and the sort of overwhelming comment my students made about Rahul Gandhi is that he'd make a great guy to lead a poetry discussion group, but maybe not to run a country, if you will. So that's poetry discussion group. Particularly given the opponents that he's dealing with. So the one that the most sort of famous or infamous candidate, of course, is Modi, and Narendra Modi, who's leading the BJP, who's chief minister, which is essentially governor of the state of Gujarat. Now, Modi is quite a well-known and controversial figure. On the one hand, he's run a tight ship in Gujarat, and Gujarat has been praised as another sort of economic development model. That Gujarat, although it's different than Kerala, is also a region of India that's held up as an example for what kind of development, letting in foreign investment, and then to a lesser degree, doing some social economic development for the many poor in Gujarat. So there's this good part of Modi in a sense, or the part of the image, and this strong image that anyways that the BJP always sort of projects. So there are, like, for example, there's kind of amusing campaign ads where they contrast the BJP and Congress as if they were teams getting ready for a football match. And so the BJP guys are all healthy, muscular, sort of handsome-looking guys with a definitive leader who's going to lead them to victory. And then so when they say captain comes up, everyone knows who the BJP captain is. The Congress Party there starts fighting with each other, and they're sort of disheveled, and they can't pick who actually the leader is. And this is sort of this analogy that Modi's the guy, kind of a CEO, kind of tough leader, is going to come in, and he's the one who can bring order to India. The difficulty, though, is that Modi was chief minister of Gujarat when there was tremendous sort of sectarian violence, particularly in 2002 between Hindus and between Muslims. And so because of the thousands of people who died during these riots in 2002, this is attached to stigma. Now, of course, for Modi and his supporters, they say, well, he was chief minister, he wasn't instigating the violence, it's not his fault. Other people say that he could have done more to halt the violence, to deploy the police and so on. Or actually, there have been accusations that government officials with some sort of support actually encouraged the violence, police participating or police telling people where people lived so they could be attacked. And so this is sort of clung on to Modi. This has interesting implications because he actually right now can't travel to the United States because of the involvement in there. The State Department won't give him a visa. So presumably if he is elected, the State Department will have to change the status.
Make a decision on that. And just to be clear, as a parliamentary system, this will have implications for who the new leader will be. Whatever, if it's not a full majority, some coalition of some kind that will have the leader emerge as the prime minister. And that's the effective head of government. Does India have a ceremonial president, I believe.
It does. It has an indirectly elected president.
So that's more of a symbolic, ceremonial duty.
Ceremonial figure.
Yeah. So the prime minister, clearly the key person who will come and emerge from this, and that's the individual you're speaking to, maybe one of those. Beyond that, as we continue, I want us to take a look in a few moments at some other various issues that are on the table. You hinted at some. Of course, there's always questions of either corruption or things that are in the past of some people, as you described that candidates. The other, at the end of the day, too, for a lot of politics and elections, it's the state of the economy, who's going to deliver, and who's going to bring change. But as well, India, a country with such challenging, complex social issues, we're going to see, what some of those are. What I'd like to say is we'll take another quick short break right now, and as we return, try to unravel what are some of the issues that are on the agenda here with the election. Will they make a difference? I mean, elections sometimes raise expectations, but sometimes, people are finding that the results aren't great, but sometimes they can be, and we'll try to get a sense of that. And the other thing, as we continue the dialogue, is looking ahead. What are the stakes? What's on the plate beyond just India itself? What does it speak to in terms of the potential changes for relations with the U.S., with regional players there? Even India, its economy has had a downturn. It's had some challenges, but it remains still an important up-and-coming country's economy. So we'll continue to unravel some of that. What are the stakes and what are the issues? We'll take another very short break right now, and we'll be back. We're here on Global Connections. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and joined today by Patrick Bratton, looking at the upcoming national elections in India and what it means, how we can understand it. And, like everything, we live in this globally interconnected world. It's important to understand what's happening because it will come back to affect us. So join us in just a minute and look forward to that. Thank you.
I'm Jay Fidel. That's Sharon Moriwaki of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum. And every Wednesday we have Hawaii, the state of clean energy. We've been doing it for some time now, and we have some fantastic guests on there, unbelievable guests who give us insight into what is going on in a very complex, sometimes very confusing, sometimes very disappointing area of progress in the state. So we love doing this. We love meeting them. We love talking to them. We love having their ideas out on the table. So maybe, just maybe, we can all make some sense of what's going on. Sharon, what do you think?
I think that's absolutely correct. We enjoy ourselves meeting with all these people and hearing about the energy and the state of clean energy, and hopefully we advance clean energy for the state. So it's terrific. Join us.
Okay, it's every Wednesday. Okay, Wednesday is Energy Day. Every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Hawaii, the state of clean energy, here on ThinkTech Hawaii. We'll see you there.
And welcome. We're back and we're live, and we're ThinkTech. This is your show, Global Connections. Your host, Carlos Juarez, and I'm joined today by Patrick Bratton, a professor of political science here at Hawaii Pacific University, a scholar who knows a lot about India. He's had many years now traveling there on a regular basis as a visiting scholar, and we'll be returning fairly soon here in what we have unraveling now, and we're trying to bring some understanding, is the upcoming national elections that are going to bring a big change in terms of reshuffling the national parliament there. There are a lot of issues on the table, and so just to maybe hit some of those, I hinted at a few of them earlier, but here's a country with a lot of, again, challenging social issues, a lot of even figures who, like every politician, have skeletons in their closet. You were hinting at some there, but give us a quick overview of what are some of the key issues that are on this election that might be defining some of the options for voters.
In a sense, not a surprise, the largest issue, if you're to take it, although it subsumes many smaller issues, would be the economy. Yeah. As you mentioned before, last year the Indian economy slowed. It was struck by very high inflation, particularly inflation that hits a lot of the population, particularly high commodity prices, so price of potatoes, price of onions, price of rice, and so on, which hits a lot of the people who are existing sort of in the poverty line and below and even above. So the economy in general is sort of the largest issue. There are subsets to that, and I think one of the great sort of other things that's driving this election is that you've had two terms for the current Congress-dominated coalition under Manmohan Singh. And most people sort of regarded that, particularly in the second term, that this has basically been a catalog of missed opportunities and disappointments. That the Congress-led government has not enacted the reforms that it should have done, and it's not acted swiftly or decisively enough to make sure the economy keeps on growing. Moreover, the government and then the state of India itself has been really rocked by a lot of corruption scandals, that have come through, some that were revealed through things like WikiLeaks, others that were revealed through normal sources. And so again, there's this kind of a collective sense of sort of disappointment, dismay, and sort of being tired of the incumbent party, and people are looking for alternatives. And one of the forms of the alternative is sort of BJP and Modi. Other one that we should also mention is the sort of AAP, the anti-corruption, the common man's party, led by Kejriwal. And so he, kind of came up, him and his party came up last year, kind of unexpected. It's not the first anti-corruption sort of party or movement. We've seen lots of these in the past, 4 or 5 years. But they were able to come up and win elections, and he was, for a very short time, chief minister in Delhi before resigning 2 months later. And so while probably this party is not going to win a huge amount of seats in the parliament, it will affect how states that have multiple candidates are going to vote. Yeah. And so probably one of the great fears, if you will, if you were Modi or the BJP, is will this lessen the probable electoral victory of BJP? Yeah. And this is particularly problematic for Modi because Modi, while I mentioned he's controversial in India and the outside of India, he's also controversial within his own party, given his sort of what they call the sort of authoritarian leadership style. And so there's kind of a debate that many political commentators are talking about, is that does Modi have a certain threshold? Does BJP have to win a certain number of seats in order for Modi to be prime minister? So if the BJP wins, but it's not a decisive win, will that mean that they'll have reason to say, okay, Modi, well, you could be minister for sanitary or something like that, some sort of thing, rather than prime minister. So I've often heard the number of 220 seats. The Lok Sabha has about 450 or about 450 seats. People have said that, are hypothesized at least, that Modi and the BJP have to win at least 220, and then that would guarantee Modi to be prime minister. So if these other parties, and there's a lot of other things that could go wrong, even if they win a sort of a plurality and they're able to get a coalition, there is that chance actually that Modi won't be prime minister.
And this process, it must be like a lot of backroom deals, or like the party leaders that have to make this decision in effect. I mean, it's not just the sheer numbers, but like you said, if they don't reach that number, they may not be willing to kind of support that. So there's a lot of little backdoor deals that have to be struck still. Well, it's a fascinating thing, and of course, I can't help but think that some of it is, looking at the role of media and how it, especially in a population that's so vast, and many people who probably get it from, I don't know what is your impression of, the way the media operates and informs, and just as we have here and elsewhere in the UK, very sensational ones. What would be your description of the nature of the media and its impact on something like this electoral process?
It's interesting. The media architecture or geography in India, much like the rest of India, it's a reflection. It's very complicated. You have a variety of newspapers, a variety of television sources, and then these are subdivided amongst languages and so on and so forth. So within the English language, you have certain newspapers. Then you get to Punjabi, you get to other types of languages. They've got their own newspapers, their own TV channels, and it's interesting to see how the different candidates seek to sort of engage with the different media. So for example, if you take somebody like Modi very rarely gives speeches or interviews in English. And he speaks English fine, like most Indians do, but it's a deliberate choice he does to the types of people that he's choosing to engage with in the message. And so you have a bit of sort of linguistic politics as well that happens in India. And so that also can very much shape the way that we view the election, because we're sort of stuck, most of us, sort of with just the English language media sources.
That's right. So we're only listening to one component, but this is where it's critical for any real observer to understand, well, what's informing the electorate, how is the media being used, or the leaders themselves, what you described as this linguistic aspect, very critical. So beyond that, of course, as you define, the economic issues often are the defining question at the end of the day for people. Will I be better off choosing X or Y candidate, or if they renege on their promises, then they lose a lot of support and so on. So people are driven by that, but it's also the spectacle, the whole image and sort of fluff that you might see here and there. As we move ahead to one of the puzzles I've often had, because here's a country with a pretty vast population that lives that has left, and diaspora communities. And interestingly, we've probably seen in recent years, the last decade especially, a situation where many who in past generations would leave and go to the UK or to the US, and that was it. They left the country behind. today, in part because of the globalization technologies, but even maybe conditions back home, there are people who probably go abroad, get experience, and now find their way coming back, and so these are sort of more globalized individuals. Or beyond that, I mean, just the large communities, the so-called diaspora that we might have abroad, especially in the U.S. and maybe U.K. Do these have any factor, any role? Are there any, way that they articulate their voice, or is it the case? I mean, my sense too is that the diaspora, are usually people who pretty much blend into their new country and become part of the, whether it's a European or American society, and other places too, in Africa and other parts of Asia, you have large diasporas of Indians. Are they any factor at all, or are there some that come back, and is that any issue?
That's a complicated question.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have this, as you mentioned, you have this long history of this very large diasporas that exist. Initially, you have a lot of this because of the British Empire was a sort of globalized system. Yeah. So Indians went all over. You have huge Indian communities, South Africa, East Indies, West Indies, all sorts of places. East Africa, and of course back in the UK. So there's this body, and particularly for this group, it's kind of interesting because many studies have shown that this older diaspora has not had that much of that many links with India.
Yeah,
that
they've broken,
moved on. Yeah. The newer diaspora, the sort of newer generations, particularly in the United States, but also the UK, other European countries, this is a group, while there are some who've settled, they're Americans, and now that we've got them in Congress and other things like that, or you can think of Bobby Jindal in Louisiana, they've gone on, definitively sort of become Indian American, if you will. You do have another group that kind of drifts back and forth, and you have a few Indian politicians that have done this. So who's in the news relatively recently? If you look at Sashi Thakur, for a while he was living in the UK, then he came back and was a minister in this Congress-dominated government. And there's a few other people like that, and businessmen as well, academics and so on, journalists who do filter back and forth between sort of Indian diaspora and these other countries and then back in India. The other part of that's interesting to bring up sort of Bobby Jindal and sort of these figures again, is interesting. I mean, one of the great sort of unsung sort of stories of this sort of Indo-US rapprochement that we've had since the late 1990s is this development of sort of Indian American lobby in the United States that wants to have closer relations between the United States and India, both for business and economic reasons, but also geopolitical, that they concern the U.S. is too close of a link with Pakistan and things. So it's an interesting, there are many facets to that sort of diaspora and how it relates back to
India. Because I mean, I have this sense, I remember a book a few years ago reading about what you have as a reverse capital flight now. People who can continue working with, maybe the high-tech industries or other global firms, have the comforts of living back home but stay connected, and so whereas they might have stayed in the UK or elsewhere, now there's more mobility. And part of it, of course, informs me. I'm a big fan of Bollywood films, and here in Hawaii we've had at least our 7th or 8th festival this past fall, and you just can't help but see in so many of these films that there's this very global sort of, somehow interconnected culture. Obviously these are elites, these are not the average person, but that they combine their Indian heritage and yet educated and able to walk circles all over the world. It's a fascinating thing to explore, and of course in some ways this is why India is important increasingly to us. We know more about it. It's more connected and interconnected, and one of the things as we take a final break in a moment, I want us to come back and look at just what are some of the possible future outcomes or the stakes from this upcoming election. How might it affect, if at all, relations whether with the U.S. or other regional partners there? Is there any difference in potential sort of foreign policy areas for the country? The other that you can help bring us up to speed on is as a country that is growing on some measure, its security, its military role, because clearly being a big power involves some of that, and how is that play out? So we'll take a final break and be back in just a moment. We're talking here today with Patrick Bratton, a scholar who has a good and keen insight into India, many years of traveling back and forth, and as we're looking to understand the upcoming national elections just starting here in a few days that will take place over the next month to help elect the next parliament in India, which has some important implications, and we'll speak to those in just a moment. So please join us after this short break.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel. This is ThinkTech Hawaii, broadcasting live from the Pioneer Plaza in downtown Honolulu. We raise public awareness about tech, energy, and globalism in Hawaii. Technology is critical to our state. A vibrant tech sector will give us new prospects in the global marketplace and will offer great careers and make our economy more resilient. Streaming live on Ustream and Spreaker, ThinkTech allows its hosts and guests invaluable opportunities to report important events and discuss important questions, and to be heard here in Hawaii and around the world. You can find links to our live streams on thinktechhawaii.com or on our mobile website, m.thinktechhawaii.com. And you can see our archive on YouTube. It's all just a click away. We want to do whatever we can to keep Hawaii relevant, connected, and thriving in the complexity of the 21st century. We hope you will help us in those efforts. Tune in today. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
And welcome back. We're live, we're ThinkTech, and this is Global Connections. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and we've had a great conversation with Patrick Bratton unraveling some of the issues coming up in the Indian national elections. And of course, Global Connections, more than anything, is designed to help bring the world here to Hawaii, help us understand a lot of what's happening around there, as well as bringing a little bit of Hawaii to the world. Our own perspective here, we're not remote and isolated, we are the center of the world, and it's where we have a vantage point to see what's happening and unraveling. And so helping us make sense of this interconnected and interdependent world. India, of course, a country that is increasingly more important, and we'll see for various reasons why. But more to immediately, as we're coming up on these elections, maybe a little bit more discussion on just what are some of the issues on the agenda, and you know, some of it, we've mentioned briefly corruption, but more specifically, you've got a number of politicians who've got, you know, sort of some baggage, some skeletons in their closet. How is that playing out in the elections, and what are some examples of the type of issues?
Well, corruption is a big one, and if you've looked, there've been lots of good polling data done by the Lowy Institute in Australia, a bunch of Gallup polls, Pew Global Attitude Survey. It's interesting because people are very, very aware of corruption in India, and they always strike it as sort of one of the major issues facing their country. Up to 70–80% people polled normally will say corruption is a major issue, and you see that in the political system with all of these scandals that we've had for the previous government. And BJP and Modi are not immune from these types of scandals that they've had. One thing that has gotten recent commentary in the international media has been sort of this revelation of the links between politicians, political families, and crime. And there's an alarming percentage of Indian politicians, sitting politicians, who have criminal records. So I think the last data that I heard is that something like 30% of sitting MPs in the Indian parliament have had charges laid against them or awaiting trial for crimes. Some 19 to 20% would be serious crimes like murder and rape and so on. Yeah. And what's interesting is that when the polling data is done, oftentimes the link to having a criminal record actually tends to be a benefit actually for the politician. That this is sort of a tough guy, a guy who can get things done. It doesn't really matter, if he's got a criminal record. We actually like the criminal record to have. And so that's actually, in the West, we would say that this would be a sort of, a skeleton in the closet that would get somebody not elected, right? Yeah. Here, in India, often it's like, wow, my MP, he's wanted for murder. That's great, in a sense.
Fantastic. Name recognition.
Name recognition. So a little bit, that's kind of a discomforting or sort of worrying factor that's increased in Indian politics.
Yeah, and I would guess, again, like the media all too often, we just sort of either sensationalize or go over things too quickly. There's not a lot of in-depth analysis, so some of these things probably just get covered at the superficial level. But at the end of the day, too, like so many places, people they're going to stick to their party, their political leaders, and some of these crimes may not be, as you put it there, something that would be putting someone else completely out of the ball game. In this case, it may not be a big issue. Well, one of the things I'd like to, as we move to bring some closure, and just a snapshot, I mean, here, India, we're talking about this important country. What are some of the potential stakes or maybe the, scenarios as we look to the future, assuming there may be either a change in government or a stagnant, even more of a, what would we call it, maybe a gridlock of sorts, whether if they're not able to get a working majority, but more specifically to its relations to the outside world. Because again, we're speaking of India because it is increasingly more connected to the global economy. There are a lot of key stakeholders, its relations with China, its relations with, of course, the US and Europe, but other areas as well. Give us maybe a quick sense of, what's at stake here for, the world as we look at India going through this important political juncture right now with these elections?
Quite critical. I mean, India, it's one of the world's largest economies. It's been a growing economy, maybe not at the same level that China or some of the East Asian tigers grew at in recent years, but still quite large amounts of growth. The economy has slightly slowed down. And one of the things here that people are sort of hoping on, if you're looking at sort of international economic interests, is that there's sort of a belief that if Modi's elected, BJP's elected, India will finally start taking further economic reforms, because a lot of the economic reforms have been sort of stalled, if you will. And so opening up India more to foreign direct investment and opening India up more to the global market will hopefully, in a sense, people are hoping that this will more sort of interconnect India and get countries more linked. Because while India has opened up, trade, at least say with the United States, has not where it could be. Remains relatively minor. Moreover, India has been trying to reach out to other countries in Asia. So you have a burgeoning sort of Indo-Japanese relationship with more of ASEAN that's been going on, rather than just the traditional relationship with Vietnam. So you're looking at an India that potentially could be even more interconnected in the global community. Yet there's a lot of unknowns about that, because on the one hand, as I've mentioned, Modi has sort of this baggage dealing with the riots back in 2002. So this is kind of a wild card what this would mean for, say, relations with Pakistan, relations with China. On the one hand, logically you would sort of infer that perhaps a BJP government would be more hawkish toward Pakistan or something like this. But if we look at the past, at least when the Prime Minister Vajpayee, the previous BJP government, was in, we saw some of the greatest steps toward sort of engagement with Pakistan, if you will, trying to normalize relations. At the same time, this was also the government that decided to turn India into an overt nuclear power, which then sparks Pakistan's developments of its overt deployment of its nuclear forces. So, we don't really know. I mean, you could say that maybe a hawkish person is the person who can engage you, much like sort of Nixon going to China. You couldn't fault him on his anti-communist credentials, so he could extend a hand to China. Could Modi be the person to extend a hand to Pakistan? Maybe. That's an unknown. Similar with China, but there's been tensions in the relationship between India and China over the border dispute and other aspects. I mean, will Modi be have a harder line against China, or will this allow him more bargaining room with China in terms of resolving difficulties? So there's a lot of unknowns, if you will.
But it would be fair to say the world is watching these regional players. You mentioned the big powers. I mean, they're looking carefully, because there's a lot at stake here. India's economy is substantial, and its role as a regional power is increasing, and it stands to reason that everyone has a stake and interest. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you, Patrick, for helping inform us about this. We're going to stay tuned, and obviously we'll have opportunities to continue this dialogue as we see the outcome. But over the next month, beginning in just a few days, India will be carrying out a broad series of national elections. Quite a challenge in a country as large as it is, but this has been a valuable chance for us to learn more about it, to deepen our understanding of these global issues. I want to thank you. We're out of time now, and so we've got to wrap things up. I'm Carlos Juarez, host here of Global Connections, part of the ThinkTech Hawaii series. Thank many who've made this possible. Thank you for being here, of course, and stay tuned as we will continue bringing you this type of informed and expert opinion on global issues. Thank the many who've made it possible: Jay Fidel, Ian, our production manager, Chrissy Goffigan, and our newest addition, Marshall, who's helping as well here in-house. And we're coming to you live here from Pioneer Plaza in the heart of downtown Honolulu. Stay tuned and continue listening in all of our shows. As you know, you can find links to them at thinktechhawaii.com, podcasts of previous episodes as well. And remember, we broadcast live here every day from 1 to 5, so never a shortage of things to hear. So I'll leave on that and just look forward to the next episode of Global Connections. Aloha, everyone.